Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about grief and how it shows up in the workplace. So without further ado, let's hop right in. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host and executive coach, Adam Melnick. With over a decade of experience in mental health, leadership, and coaching, I aim to help you understand leadership through a mental health lens. So let's sit back, relax, and have a chat. I remember working in a long-term care center. This long-term care center wasn't your typical long-term care center. It didn't deal with elderly, but instead dealt with stroke and heart attack individuals, dealt with people that had cerebral palsy or that had Huntington's disease. I worked with everybody from the age of 16 all the way up to 95. What made this long-term care center unique, beyond the fact that my clientele was not just old people, was the high amount of people that passed away in it. See, this place that I worked at was more like a palliative care unit, a place individuals go when they are ready to pass on to the next life. It was quite common to have individuals pass away either through natural means or medical-assisted suicide. For a little bit there, I would have 2 residents a month pass away. This was normal. There was one gentleman that I remember was my patient. We'll call him Leon. Leon was a son of a bitch. He's a real nasty person. But he had a condition called multiple sclerosis, or MS. This condition meant that his nervous system was no longer working the way it was supposed to. And there was a very real possibility for him that one day he was going to drown in the fluids of his own lungs. This reality terrified him, absolutely terrified him, to the point that he decided he wanted to have medical-assisted suicide than experience that painful, awful death. I remember the lead up to the medical-assisted suicide, watching him go through the 7 stages of grief, helping him cope with it, and helping him move into a world of acceptance. Because his time was coming, and he was beginning to grieve the loss of his life. The interesting thing is, he himself was not only grieving, but the people around him were grieving in a very weird way. Because he was a real piece of work, a lot of the staff didn't like him. And I remember the day that he had passed away, and one of my colleagues said, "Is it so bad that I feel relief? That can I feel happy?" My answer to that was no. No, it's not. See, when you grieve, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. There is no handbook or guidebook. Grieving is an intensely personal experience, and for some people, they feel relief, they feel happiness. Like I remember working with one lady whose father had passed away. Well, her father had done horrific things to her as a child. And when her father passed away, she felt happy. She felt happy that her abuser was no longer on this planet. And this is okay. What I've found in my work is that grief is misunderstood. People simply don't understand grieving or the grieving process, to the point that I've seen leaders misinterpret their employees' actions as being disgruntled, when the reality is that their team is in a grieving process. If you are able to identify this, we can do interventions to make sure our team comes out stronger on the other side. What is grief? Grief is an emotion that you are going to experience after a significant loss. I'm going to put emphasis on significant loss. Because when you hear that, you generally think grief is about losing a loved one, and it's not. I have seen people grieve over loved ones. I've seen people grieve over a loss of a limb. I had a woman that had her right leg amputated, and she went through the grieving process. I've seen people grieve relationships that have come to an end. I've seen them grieve over marriages, grieve over the loss of their youth, their fertility, loss of a job, loss of a career. They've gone through the grieving process over a diagnosis. When the doctor comes in and says, "You have osteoporosis," they begin to grieve because all of a sudden they have lost their youth, and this is a life-changing event. I have seen individuals grieve over the loss of a dream. I had one gentleman that wanted to be a firefighter all his life. He was told he could never be a fighter because he had scoliosis, and it was so bad he could never carry anything on his back. He went through the grieving process. And the thing about the grieving process is the grieving process is a natural human response. This is normal. It can be a very strong process, or it can be a very weak process. It depends on how significant the loss is. A fabulous example of this is if my parents passed away, I will have a very strong grieving process. But if I lost a cousin, I will have a very weak grieving process. If I believe and have my identity wrapped into nursing, and I was told I could no longer be a nurse, I would have a very strong grieving process. But if I had already been moving away from nursing, and I lost the ability to be a nurse, I would have a very weak grieving process. Grief is a very unique emotion to the individual. Everybody will experience grief differently. Some people may grieve for a few weeks or months. Others may grieve for a full year. Sometimes when we see grief, we think of it as being depression. But how we know it's not is because it's attached to a significant loss. In the workplace, I typically see leadership misidentifying grief, and it is heartbreaking. If you have a core team, an amazing team of individuals, and one of the pillars, one of the old standbys retires, your team can fall into a grieving process. When you do change management, when you are changing the fundamentals on how the organization works, your team may begin to grieve what was. When you dissolve somebody's position, or when you demote somebody, or maybe even promote them, they may fall into a grieving process. They have a significant loss around their title or position. And we need to understand that individuals experience grief. And our job is to help identify it and then help our team through it. Because if you fail to identify when your team is in mourning, when you fail to identify when your team is grieving, you will destroy your team and you will be doing an entirely new hiring process. I always find it funny that when we talk about the stages of team development, we tend to focus on the forming, the norming, the storming, and performing, but we never talk about the disintegration. When our team goes through a loss, if we aren't careful, our team will disintegrate. I have seen this play out more times than I care to admit. So how do we identify grief? The first one to understand is it's around a significant loss. If you have a colleague that is particularly well loved and they leave an organization, your team will grieve. If somebody passes away and people know about them, they will grieve. If you are completely overhauling the entire organization and how its processes and procedures are going to be, there is going to be a mourning or grieving process your people are going to go through. Any change that we do, we need to understand there may be a loss associated with it. When somebody is in mourning, again, it's very unique to the individual. It may take them a few weeks, take them a few months, or a couple of years to move through this grieving process. When we look at the process of grieving, we look at the stages. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This is not a linear process. People do not start at denial and end at acceptance. They hop all over the place. They may skip stages or they may revisit stages as many times as they need. A fabulous example of this is I remember seeing a structural reorg. Corporations love their structural reorgs these days, where a number of team members were let go of. This triggered a massive grieving process within a team where people started being like, no, they can't do this to us. Like, we put so much time and energy into the company. How could they treat us with such disrespect? Denial, followed closely behind by anger. They don't respect us and they don't respect the work that we put in. How dare they fire our team members? We should walk out. We should really show them who's boss. Maybe they start bargaining. Maybe I'll just wait it out at this job. I'll just wait it out for a few more weeks, see how it goes. If I like it, I might hate it. We'll wait it out. And then they might fall back to anger. But why the hell should I wait it out? These people don't appreciate me and they don't appreciate what I bring to the table. Now they fall into acceptance. It's just a job. They're a dime a dozen, and I should just learn to accept it. And then they might fall back into anger. But why should I have to put up with this BS? I should just leave, find a new place. I have seen individuals stick primarily in the denial stage of grief. I have seen them bounce all over the place, from acceptance to denial, back to anger, back to acceptance, back to denial, to anger, into a depression, back into bargaining. Now we're back into denial, all over the place. These are not linear. Your team will visit these stages as many times as they need to in order to get over their grief for as long as it takes. But it's not only the stages of grief that you're going to start seeing. You may start noticing an increase in worker output. Well, why? Because they're grieving and they're trying to distract themselves, so they're going to work harder. Or you might start noticing a decrease in worker output because they're depressed. You may see an increase in depression with your team. They may lack enthusiasm or happiness. You might see sadness. You might start seeing angry outbursts in meetings. Well, why are they having these angry outbursts? Because they're grieving. A significant loss happened, and this is them grieving. You may notice them being very fatigued and tired all the time. They always complain about not getting enough sleep. They may have a reduced in appetite, so they're not going to be taking their breaks. They're not really going to be eating their food. They'll have trouble thinking. They'll be as if they're in a fog or a daze. They're going to have memory issues. They may forget things that you told them. Their relationships at work are going to be strained because they are grieving. And you may notice that they're going to be talking in a hopeless manner. When they talk about projects or change, they may say, "Why bother? It's all pointless anyways." This is hopeless thinking, and this is a common speech pattern for individuals that are severely depressed. When we start seeing these things, we need to be detectives and understand that what we might be seeing is a grieving process. And if we're recognizing that we're in a grieving process, we can begin to take steps to help our team members move through this process. I always find it funny. Retirement parties and going away parties are actually just funerals for the living. See, what most people don't understand is funerals are not for the dead. They are for the living. It is to help them with the grieving process. It is the same thing with retirement parties and going away parties. Your team is in a grieving process and they need to move through it. And so why do we have retirement parties? Why are going away parties so important? Well, because one, our team is going to be grieving. It's a way for our team to process their grief with others. It creates that social atmosphere where they can talk about what they're feeling and not feel ashamed and feel supported instead. It provides them with healing. It provides a space for them to grieve, to talk about the good times, the bad times, the times that they struggled with and were able to overcome. It gives your team an opportunity to say goodbye to the coworkers or the loved ones. And it creates an understanding amongst everyone in the team of what is going on. Many leaders do not do retirement parties or going away parties, and it is to the detriment of your team, which is causing you huge problems with morale, worker output, and the quality of life of your workers. When we look at it, it's important to have retirement parties. It's important to have going away parties. This is how we support our people. But it's more than that. When we look at leadership, we as leaders need to be reaching out to our people while they are grieving. We need to be proactive in stopping in and saying, hey, how are you doing? This is why it's so important that we have established beforehand these relationships with our people so we can check in on them and we can get the truth on how they're feeling. When we step in and we ask them how they're doing, we do need to provide a listening ear. Remember, we are not fixing anything. We are just helping them through the grieving process by listening. We're not telling them what to do. We're not giving them advice. We listen. And this is why it's also important to create group events. I always hosted team building events such as paint nights or potlucks when my team was going through a grieving process. Why? Promoted social connection and helped encourage my team to lean on each other, to help each other through the grieving process. It was important to build those healthy relationships. It's also important to allow your team to express themselves. Again, they're going to be angry. They're going to be depressed. They may be in the bargaining phase or the acceptance phase or the denial phase. It's important to listen to them and accept them where they are at. Many leaders will see, for example, a team member get angry during a meeting and will immediately try to shut it down, as opposed to listen from empathy and understand this team member is grieving and they are in the anger stage. And we need to help them move from that anger stage to a healthier place. And this is why at times we need to recognize when this is too much for us. And we need to reach out and say, hey, Jim, hey, Lucy, I would like you to see a therapist. This is too much for me. Most organizations have an employee assistance program where team members can get mental health help for free. It's important to understand what mental health services are accessible with your organization and plug your team members into them. We want them to be healthy. We want them to get help. The last 2 points that we need to encourage with our team is 1, self-care. We need to encourage our people to look after themselves and make themselves happy, to make themselves feel better. Because if we can do that, they can move through the grieving process in a much healthier way and come out stronger on the other side. And lastly, we need to stick to a routine. The last thing you should do when your people are grieving is do change management or a reorg. No. Stick to a routine. Make the work life predictable. Predictability comes with stability. And through that stability, it gives your people a platform to work through their grief. Because if you start doing a lot of change management, if you start changing things up on your people, they're already dealing with the grieving process. And now you are going to compound and inflame that grieving process. Don't do that. Keep it routine. So to recap a lot of what we've talked about, grief is an emotion that you're going to feel or your team is going to feel when there's a significant loss, whatever that may be. It can be either a strong emotion or a weak emotion, and it could take them anywhere between a few weeks to a few years to work through this process. This is normal. When we enter the stages of grief, this is where we're going to see denial, depression, anger, acceptance, and bargaining. This is not a linear process. Some people will experience all the stages, some may only experience one or two. Individuals will bounce around between the stages and can revisit them at any time. They may spend a lot of time in certain stages and no time at all in other stages. When they are grieving, we look at worker output. Are they just working less or are they working more? We look for signs of depression, angry outbursts, fatigue and exhaustion, strain on their interpersonal relationships, which means that their coworkers' relationships may be strained during this process. They may not be eating and skipping lunch breaks. They're going to have trouble thinking. They're going to have memory issues and feelings of hopelessness. When we start seeing those signs, it's important that we reach out to our people. We redirect them to a therapist if we need to. We provide a listening ear. We don't solve problems, we are just listening. We create group events like potlucks, laser tag, paint nights to allow the team to come together and support each other. We allow the individuals to express themselves without judgment so we can hear them and come from a place of empathy. And we stick to a routine. We don't surprise them with curveballs. Now's not the time. Now's the time to help them through the grieving process. And when they are done, now we can move on. It's important that when people leave our organization, we host retirement parties or going away parties. Why? It helps with the grieving process. It helps our people say goodbye to each other. It helps create the support networks, and it helps create a place of understanding for everybody. This is a bit of a longer episode. This is a massive topic, and we've only kind of touched on the surface. If you're interested in learning more, please reach out, and I'd be happy to discuss this in as much detail as required. I hope you learned something, and I shall see you in the next episode where we discuss feedback. Cheers. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, give it a like, and share it with a friend. And if you're ready to take the next leap and improve your leadership skills, head over to www.seatingthelead.com and book your free coaching session today.